Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now it's exactly 2 days before elections. Political parties held their final rallies this past weekend, reinforcing their message to the electorate. Political analyst Dr. Hlengiwe Ndlovu joins us now to unpack those campaigns. Doctor, good afternoon and thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon and good afternoon to your listeners.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. So perhaps to start with the all-important, we've heard from many pundits that these are by far the most consequential elections since those of 1994. We've heard from the business sector saying they're very crucial for our democracy and even the strengthening of reforms. Where do you place these elections insofar as their significance is concerned 30 years into our democracy?
Very well, very significant elections, rightfully saying, 30 years into democracy, a time for reflection, not only for the South Africans, but also in terms of what does it mean for the continent, looking at some of the lessons, if any, that have been learned over the years from other liberation parties, for instance, and where are we in terms of our democratic space. So for the longest time, we've maintained that we are a young democracy, but 30 years is not young anymore. It's a grown democracy that should be having clear direction in terms of where are we going, but also reflecting on how far we've come. And that's
what has
important.
not been lost on me is a specific article written by Busisiwe Mavuso of BLSA. She went on to state that beyond everything that we've seen, what South Africa should be proud of is that every 5 years we're able to converge and have very peaceful and credible elections, which speaks of a very strong democracy as young as it is.
Absolutely. I think that cannot be taken away. And as I've already said, that's relative to what we are observing from our neighboring countries, but also countries within the region in terms of the peacefulness and everything. But also, I think it goes deeper than that in terms of what democracy means. For ordinary people on the streets, for me and you sitting here, what does democracy mean? What does it look like? Are we even can we, for instance, proudly claim that we are in a democracy, and what are the characteristics of democracy? And I've written in some of my work in the documentary that I've recently released, the Nkululeko, in terms of what does democracy mean for ordinary people in the informal settlement of East London of Duncan Village. What does democracy mean for people who consistently vote over and over again but haven't really seen a significant change in terms of their lifestyle, but also for the older voters who have in some instances seen, a regression in terms of the advancement of their lifestyle. So democracy has got those, good sides to say we maintain the institution of democracy, as a political system, but also in concrete terms, what does that mean? I think that's a big question that is going to inform, the voters' choice.
Now, if we had to speak on the voters' choice, the manifestos, a cursory look at those manifestos, to a certain degree, many have said that they look quite similar. It seems everybody knows what the main issues are, be it load shedding, unemployment, policing, and broader service delivery issues. But it seemed what was lacking was the nuances in governance, the how everybody is going to ensure that these things are addressed. What was your take on some of just those manifestos and the fact that there were so many similarities?
Well, I believe there is a broader grasp in terms of, as you are putting it, what are the pressing issues currently in South Africa, and what is the public outcry all about in terms of load shedding and all other issues, service delivery and all of them, as we have kept at them. But also what we haven't seen, as we are saying, is the nuances behind, the explanations. So there is a beautiful articulation, if I might put it, of what are the problems, but we haven't really seen in terms of the implementation strategy. Some of the strategies are quite broad and are quite ambitious, and at the end of the day, you are left with wondering whether what is implementable and what is not. Also, I've looked at the question of gender specifically. in terms of how it has been purported out there, it has been articulated in terms of gender-based violence, femicide, gender transformation in different spaces. But we haven't really heard beyond, you know, the 50-50, the zebra approach, the quota systems and everything. What's new is coming, or what's new is in the promises in terms of how is that going to be implemented. So you find that some of the strategies are lacking practicality, for instance, to say, okay, when we implement this, how are we going to do it? How is it going to look like in the real life? Do we even have resources as a country to implement some of the grand claims? And that is still missing.
Some say we need to look to the past to somehow secure the future. Yesterday we heard the president reflecting on the 6th administration. He went on to speak of them stabilizing institutions that had been hollowed out. Just last week, we saw the signing of the National Prosecuting Authority's Amendment Bill, something that was much needed insofar as the security of tenure for the Independent Investigating Directorate, the ID. Now, there you had a situation where you couldn't attract a lot of skill because it was not permanent. But now it has been made permanent, so a number of people might now be able to take up those posts within the ID. But where would you place, or if we had to reflect on the 6th administration, how have they fared?
Well, I think to be fair, we need to give credit to wherever it belongs, wherever it's valid. Taking the country from 1994 and also placing South Africa within the broader global politics when we transitioned between the period of 1990 to 1994, that our timing for this particular transition, collided with the end of the Cold War and what it meant in terms of ideological triumph. So some of the problems that we've seen over the years, but also gains, can be understood in light of the broader global politics in terms of, the neoliberal policies and what they meant. So some of the issues that we've reflected on as losses for South Africans is the privatization of public services, like your everyday public delivery. Like access to electricity, access to water, and all of those things. So they should be read in light of that. We understand that there's been a connection to the grid, to water and everything, but also the question remains, what are the shortfalls?
Now that you talk of privatization, the big P in the room, because we've seen with many of these manifestos, a number of them are keen to work a bit closely with the private sector. And they've said it shouldn't be something that we shy away from. But when we look at the more left-leaning political parties, they tend to not be so keen to have the private sector now being given the role which should belong to government insofar as service delivery is concerned. I know Thabo Mbeki has once raised concern on that we seem to now be over-relying on the private sector for the very basic of services that government needs to deliver.
Absolutely. I think the role of the private sector is to be treated with caution. I think in South Africa, we haven't really found a good balance in terms of how are we balancing the public sector and the private sector to complement each other. So if we look at this history of 30 years into democracy and see what privatization has done for the majority of South Africa, what does it mean to privatize basic services specifically for people who have been, for years and years, for decades actually, excluded from the services? So when you're making them to pay, of course, on one hand, we can read it as taking responsibility, but on the other hand, at what footing are they beginning? So those are some of the sticky questions that we still need to grapple with. And because we do not have policies, or maybe we might have policies in place, but the implementation in terms of the guiding strategies and all of them is still lacking. So as a result, it's quite a tricky relationship that we speak about privatization, but also basic services, but also looking at the level of inequality in South Africa and the depth of poverty within the country, and wanting to ask ourselves, can the majority of South Africans afford privatize the basic services?
Now, with such divergent views from these political parties, we hear that this is the year of coalitions. I was actually reading an article on the Mail and Guardian where they had quoted Helen Zille saying that it was actually an anomaly that the ANC had been able to maintain above 50% for 30 years now. They are of the view that everybody will definitely go below. It will be a situation where they need to coalesce and work together. So what really becomes of governance where we need stability? We've seen at local government level, they have divergent views. So will we see the stability that South Africans honestly need?
I think the local government elections of 2021 have told us one or two things about coalition government. At a local level, the most basic, where it can be assumed that it's manageable. And I think it's the anxiety of every South African who's going to be casting their vote in terms of what does it mean if we're headed for coalition at a national level. Of course, there is the new bill that has just been amended, but within the Local Municipalities Structures Act, but also in terms of how that translates into a national level, especially where there are ideological differences that do not even at some point attempt to find a common ground. I think it remains a bigger question in terms of how is that going to be managed and what does it mean for South Africans.
Should we be worried though? Should we be worried? Because as you say, ideology somehow finds expression even in these elections. We talk of the left, we talk of the right, we even talk of the centrists, those that are more in the center. You have your IFPs that are also pushing more in the center. So what would become of a South Africa if we even had to look at the NHI right now? It's been signed into law, it creates some level of certainty, but many would still argue that just the very signing has opened another can of worms. There is now absolute uncertainty.
Maybe this is a reality that we are faced with as South Africa. I don't think we can run away from it any longer, but I don't think the worriness is going to go away anytime soon, given that coalitions are not working yet at a local level. And I think these are some of the things that really the next few days, if we happen, to get into coalition, are going, to give us, whether from a legal perspective, in terms of how are we constituting the National Assembly, how are we constituting, all these different structures of governance, is going to be interesting in terms of how we are going to be moving forward as a country post these elections.
Would it be beneficial to introduce some sort of legal framework to govern coalitions? Because I know the Democratic Alliance had attempted to introduce a bill that would allow for there to be some sort of a framework that binds them together.
I think that will be a step forward in terms of having a guiding mechanisms, but I don't think that the start is actually in the legalities per se. I think also there is an element of practicality in terms of who can work with who and what does that mean in a practical sense when we deploy these different individuals in one space. So we've seen how the dynamics have turned out in Parliament, especially when they are voting for some of the critical things, critical issues that are affecting South Africans. We've seen some of those decisions taking time because of those diverging views, diverging ideologies, and also questions around implementation. So a guiding document, legal document is fine, but also at a practical level, how does it look like? Like our constitution, we have the most beautiful constitution, but we continue, to experience these challenges despite. So it's a question of how do we translate the legalities, how do we translate the strategies into the practical.
Then if we had to look at the permutations, many are already keen to know where you would see the ANC, if ever it dipped below the 50% that we've been hearing of. Who would they ideally coalesce with?
Well, I think there has to be a lot of discussions behind the doors. I think we've had, some of the public statements in terms of who the DA doesn't want to coalesce with and who does it want to coalesce with. But also, I think it's also in the interest of the ANC, even though it might dip under 50-1. I think they will still remain with the majority of numbers given the institutional memory of the political party, and some other issues that we can have a separate discussion around. But also we have these dominant, opposition parties.
And the multi-party charter.
Yes.
Because some are of the view that it's probably going to be tested this time around, insofar as the loyalty is concerned, as the polls open. That here, if many of them had spoken prematurely to say, I will not work with Party X or Party Y, that possibly, once we start to see those numbers, a number of those political parties, even in that multi-charter, might be willing to work with others. Your views on that?
Definitely. I think the unfortunate part, whether we like it or not, politics is a game of numbers. So in terms of who gets the numbers and who become the majority, where will also play a role in terms of who comes on board and who doesn't. And also you are right about, some of them might have to swallow their their words back and reflect in terms of what does this mean, especially in this context, if they find themselves within this space where they have to come together and govern.
In the past few days, when looking at the multi-party charter for South Africa, there's been a conversation yet again that has resurfaced around if they were to garner enough support to lead the country, govern the country, whether South Africa would be ready for a John Steenhuisen perhaps to become the president. Helen Zille was interviewed and she said of course he would be. He would be somebody that can lead, but when listening to the FF+, they would say they still don't believe South Africa is ready, and for them, they have endorsed IFP leader Velenkosini Hlabisa. Where do you stand on just that argument?
Well, I think it's a fair argument to make it depending on each political party in terms of where they are standing and how they are gauging, their strength. But also it has to do with the experience within the opposition bench or within the affairs of the country. I think the DA is in a better position to articulate that, given the years in which they've held the Western Cape province alone, but also in terms of, the maturity of the political party, of which is understandable for younger or sort of like new, relatively new political parties when they come into the space to say, are we ready, to have a candidate who qualifies to be a president for the country? And I think it's a fair reflection, really, where individual parties are introspecting in terms of their leadership capabilities, but also in terms of what they can and what they cannot within the space.
Then to KwaZulu-Natal, the emergence of the MK party. Many have been saying that possibly the MK party would be a regional party, very strong in KwaZulu-Natal, but they're adamant that they will have a footprint in all 9 provinces. Where do you place this new kid on the block?
I think the MK party, if we were in the local government elections, I would be very ambitious about their influence in terms of, where they stand. But also, I think this has got to be taken back, to the politics of the province, not just within the political space, but it's also, I think it goes deeper than that in terms of the leadership question within the region. Now that the late King Zwelithini is gone, and then the late advisor Mangosu Tubuthelezi as well, as so now Jacob Zuma becomes one of the elders within the traditional leadership structures, and I think that will have an impact in terms of the alignments, especially from the ordinary people within the KZN and how they align their political interests with the leadership within the province, and I think that will be very interesting to observe.
Quite a very interesting perspective. So you're saying an ANC provincially that is led by Siboniso Duma, an IFP that is provincially led by Thami Ntuli, cannot really stand against the Jacob Zuma factor, because their provincial leadership now is not all that know. But would you say that just the former president's factor is above these, and probably you're seeing that a number of people in KZN might lean towards supporting the MK party?
Yes, so the argument that I'm making is that we need to look beyond politics and understand the nuances around the KZN province, around the traditional culture within the Zulu people, and the understanding of traditional leadership and traditional authority. And I'm saying that might have, effect. It might play a role in terms of what people decide. And this is especially given that the numbers are telling us that the older population still remains the majority of the voters, and the younger people haven't been coming on board. So that has got implications in terms of some of the decisions that could be made by an ordinary voter.
Doctor, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Dr. Hlengiwe Ndlovu, political analyst, speaking to us there on just some of those permutations as we edge ever so closely to Election Day on Wednesday.